Hello Total War fans, welcome back to our Rise of Cao Cao Part 3, The Hero of Chaos. This is Sons of Three Kingdom, and again this video is about the historical rise of Cao Cao and what took him from a minor warlord to the most powerful man in China. So when we last left him at 197 AD, Cao Cao had established his political, his economic, and his philosophical base, and had controlled a sliver of territory around the modern-day Yellow River. This territory is historically known as the Central Plains. It stretches from around Chang'an in the west, the old capital, to his home base of Xuchang and Chenliu in the east. Now, as we mentioned again and again, China at this point was comprised of 13 provinces, and the land that Cao Cao held accounted to about 1.5 provinces, although it should be mentioned that it was a particularly war-torn 1.5. Cao Cao, although a prominent warlord by this time, was surrounded by a lot of potential rivals and some outright enemies. To his north, he has his old friend and former ally, Yuan Shu, who controlled a large swath of territory north of the Yellow River and was at this point probably the most powerful warlord in China. To his south, he had Yuan Shu, Yuan Shao's younger brother, and again Cao Cao's former comrade within the coalition against Dongzhuo, who controlled vast swaths of southeast China and was, like Yuan Shu, probably the first or second most powerful faction. Other notable figures include to his east, where he had Lu Bu, the god of war, and Liu Bei, one of the progenitors of the other three kingdoms. Together they roughly controlled the Shu province, that is the province that Cao Cao disastrously tried to attack in revenge for his father's death. To the south, meanwhile, there was a powerful warlord Liu Biao who ruled over the Jing province, and in particular his general Zhang Xiu, who controlled Wan Castle, which controlled the passes between Cao Cao's Yan province and Liu Biao's Jing province, and was ultimately the lifeline between the north and the south for Middle China. Now, from the years of 197 to 199 AD, which is when Cao Cao began to see his military rise along with his political rise, we have three key conflicts he was involved in. The first are the wars against Zhang Xiu, the second is the campaign against Yuan Shu, and the third is the Battle of Xiapi against Lu Bu, the so-called god of war. The first one we're going to have to focus on is the war against Zhang Xiu. As the smallest and also closest independent faction close to Cao Cao, Zhang Xiu made the logical step for a first advance. Specifically, Zhang Xiu also held Wan Castle, which was so close to Cao Cao's home base in Xuchang that if Cao Cao was going to go campaigning anywhere else, he really needed to secure Wan Castle first. And so, in February 197 AD, Cao Cao declared war on Zhang Xiu, and in the name of the Han government, marched south upon Wan Castle. Now, before we get to the details of this campaign, we're going to have to get acquainted with a few of the key characters on this campaign. Whilst many more characters might have been involved, these were the characters called out in history for having some special role in one way or another. On Cao Cao's side, we had Cao Cao overall in command, but another key figure was Dian Wei, who was at this point the de facto head of Cao Cao's personal guards. Among his officers, the ones involved heavily in this campaign also includes Cao Ang, who is his eldest son, Cao Anmin, who is a clansman, most likely a nephew, and Yu Jin, who at this point was a colonel serving under Cao Cao. On Zhang Xiu's side, meanwhile, we only have two people to call out aside from Zhang Xiu himself. One is his officer Hu Chi-er, and another is his advisor Jia Xu. Now, Zhang Xiu is the nephew of Zhang Ji. Zhang Ji is one of the chief lieutenants of Dongzhuo. Dongzhuo had 4 chief lieutenants, and Zhang Ji usually ranked 3rd among them. So, whilst Zhang Xiu was not a senior member of Dongzhuo's regime, he was absolutely part and parcel of it. He was known to be brave and charismatic during his youth. He was a seasoned warrior and captain, as everybody in Dongzhuo's factions were, due to both their actions within the Xiliang province against the local Qiang tribes and later their war against the coalition. He's not a man who was ambitious or treasonous at heart. A lot of the times, he played a mediating role, and actually this is true of his uncle Zhang Ji as well. He played a mediating role within Dongzhuo's regime, trying to stop some of their excesses against the emperor and the court, and trying to be more conciliatory to a lot of the local gentries and political factions. And as we mentioned, at this time he was allied with Liu Biao. One small anecdote about Zhang Xiu's youth and how he rose to power is that, to quote the Record of the Three Kingdoms, this is during Zhang Xiu in his very early career, Chu Sheng of Jincheng attacked Liu Jin, prefect of Zuli, and killed him. Zhang Xiu was a minor officer in the prefecture office at that time, and he personally tracked Chu Sheng down and killed him. All within the commandery praised him for that. Thus, Zhang Xiu gathered many young people to himself and became a formidable force within the neighborhood. So this is what I was talking about back in part 1 about how politics in China often worked at this time. As the empire was falling apart and there was less and less central governance and the traditional structures of hierarchy were breaking down, it really came to a lot of these minor officers and officials like Cao Cao, like Zhang Xiu, who took initiative at what they saw were the injustices and chaos rising around them. And that is how Zhang Xiu got his start. The next character we have to mention is Jia Xu, the famed strategist. Now, there's a lot of nicknames in modern Greater China or East Asian kind of pop culture about this man. I quite like a lot of them. There was a comic series called Ravages of Time coming out of Hong Kong, which calls him the Herald of Darkness. There is in China, he's commonly known as the Poisonous Strategist. So this is a man who is known really for his cunning, his mind games, and how he was able to constantly outmaneuver his enemies so many times on the battlefield, despite technically not really being an officer and not having that many frontline experiences. So at this point, he was an advisor of Zhang Xiu, and previous to that, he was also with Zhang Xiu serving under Dong Zhuo, again in a relatively minor capacity. He was also a famed strategist, and he was, as history would later prove out, a political and military expert. Jia Xu's first action of note, as recorded by the histories, was in the immediate aftermath of Dong Zhuo's assassination during the coup led by Lu Bu and several Han Court loyalists. At this time, there was a lot of great fear. Lu Bu had essentially seized the central government, and all of those chief lieutenants that we mentioned earlier, including Zhang Xiu's uncle Zhang Ji, were, in a sense, trying to decide what to do. This is what the Record of the Three Kingdoms says about this entire period. When Dong Zhuo was killed, all were fearful. Colonels Li Jue, Guo Si, and Zhang Ji, among others, proposed to disband and take back roads to their homes. Jia Xu said, "I heard that in Chang'an they were talking about killing all the men from the Liang province. If you, good sirs, were to leave the group and travel alone, even a commune chief can take you. We will be better off traveling as a group, recruiting soldiers as we go along in order to attack Chang'an and avenge Lord Dong. If we are lucky and our plan goes well, then we can conquer the world in the name of the dynasty. But even if we fail, it will not be too late to flee then." Commenting later on these advice, Pei Songzhi, the famous historian who, unlike the other primary historian Chen Shou, he actually lived hundreds of years after the event, but he provided a set of annotations to the Records of the Three Kingdoms that are now considered canonical. This is what he had to say. "Because of him," meaning Jia Xu, "the empire suffered sorrows of death and destruction, and the commoners suffered from that which plagued the end of the dynasty. Are these not all due to the crimes of just several words from Jia Xu? How great then is Jia Xu's crime? Such turmoil had not been known since times of antiquity." So what did he mean by this? Well, let's break it down. The regime had fallen, and had this gone like any other time, the central government was seized by Lu Bu along with the backing of the court. And Dong Zhuo and his remnants, as we talked about, these were several thousand men with their home base in the Liang province, so very, very far away from Chang'an. And they all decided to disband. And that is what Lu Bu, as well as the court that held the coup, was counting on. Instead, what Jia Xu understood is that very old and timeless advice, in times of political change and confrontation, violent confrontation that is, the key is always just to get there first with the most people. And that's what Jia Xu was counting on, and that's exactly what Lu Bu was counting on they would not do. So Jia Xu organized these dispirited and about to flee leaders, and they recruited an army and marched straight on the capital. They didn't go back to the Liang province, they didn't tarry, they didn't try to return to safety, or maybe return to the Liang province and then raise a force and march back onto Chang'an. Jia Xu knew that that would be too late. And so all of the loyalists of Dongzhuo marched upon Chang'an, and Lu Bu and the new court found that they didn't have anywhere near enough the amount of men to stop them. And thus Chang'an fell, and the emperor and the court fell back into the hands of Dongzhuo's remnants. Now, unfortunately, they were not able to keep it together. Well, fortunately, from the perspective of most of China, but unfortunately for them, they were not able to keep it together and fell to infighting. And it was during this time that men such as Zhang Ji and Zhang Xiu and Jia Xu, they really played a mediating factor because Li Jue and Guo Si, there were lots of accounts of them kind of tormenting the court or kidnapping the emperor. All these very offensive shenanigans as far as a Confucianist would be concerned. Now, the last word on Jia Xu, he's not, as I mentioned, a frontline battlefield commander, and the role of advisor within the context of the Three Kingdoms is actually rather vague. But again and again in history, whether recorded by his contemporaries, people immediately after him, both from the side of somebody who was for Cao Cao or somebody who was against Cao Cao, what we see about Jia Xu as a general comment is that he was able to make very prescient advice that strategically made a lot of sense, but not from a military standpoint, just from a pure human standpoint, it can almost be said. I mean, I don't want to get too mythical about this, but I think what set him apart is that he really understood how humans behaved and acted and what they wanted. You could almost think of him as a Game of Thrones Littlefinger type figure, although considerably more honorable and less self-serving. That is something we do not see from Jia Xu. He is not a self-serving man, he's not a deceitful man. He advises whoever he's serving to the best of his abilities. If Jia Xu represented somebody who is the epitome of loyal but cunning, then Dian Wei epitomized the other aspect, loyal but brave. Dian Wei, who at this point was really the de facto head of Cao Cao's personal guard, started off as a minor officer serving under Xia Hodun, Cao Cao's general and maybe cousin, maybe not. He's known for his loyalty and bravery, and famed for his martial prowess. His armament of choice had significant flair. He wielded two hand halberds, each weighing 40 jin. 40 jin is about 20 kilos, so he wielded 40 kilos of steel on him. He distinguished himself among many other feats at the Battle of Puyang. Now, Puyang, you might remember from part 2, is the first climactic standoff between Lu Bu and all of Cao Cao's mutineers against Cao Cao himself during the 100 days of battles where neither side had any supplies and really any land they were holding on to. So this is what history books said about Dian Wei at that battle. To the west of Puyang, Lu Bu had various camps stationed 40 to 50 lees away. Now each li is half a kilometer, so this is about 20 to 25 kilometers. Cao Cao led a night raid and broke through the lines. Afterwards, Lu Bu's reinforcements arrived and engaged in a three-pronged attack. Lu Bu personally joined the battle, which lasted from dawn until day, as the situation became quite desperate. At this time, the west flank was in trouble. Dian Wei went forth with 10 armored men to help. The arrows came down like rain, but he took no notice, instead telling the troops, "Tell me when they are 10 paces away." The troops then cried, "10 paces!" Again, Dian Wei instructed, "Tell me when it's 5 paces." The troops were fearful and cried, "They're here!" With his hands, Dian Wei held on to over 10 halberds. Deeply exhaling, he rose against the troops, knocking them down. Lu Bu's army retreated. So essentially, this is a story we see again and again from the really martial legends of the Three Kingdoms. As I mentioned before, during the early Three Kingdoms, these battles were largely disorganized, somewhat unprofessional affairs. So it really required on the personal bravery and quick thinking and martial prowess of individual officers and their close group of heavily armed and well-trained retainers to turn the tide of battle, and in this case, Dian Wei personally essentially laid a one-man ambush, or maybe a 10-man ambush. The history wasn't entirely clear upon that, and he turned the battles on a flank by holding the line against these men and laying this kind of surprise ambush where they all rose up at once as the enemy approached. So that's the manner of man we're talking about with Dian Wei. Now with the players set, let's go to the campaign. In mid to late February in 197 AD, Cao Cao marched on Zhang Xiu, leaving his trusted Lord strategist Xun Yu behind, guarding Xuchang as he always does. Now, Liu Biao at this time was too far away to help, and so within a few weeks, when Cao Cao arrived at Wancheng, Zhang Xiu promptly threw open his gates and surrendered. Okay, obviously that's not the end of the story, or else we wouldn't be talking about it. So Cao Cao and Zhang Xiu feasted for days, toasting each other on this peaceful resolution, and Zhang Xiu joining the fold of Cao Cao and also technically the Han court. But at this point, as will become a trait, Cao Cao's love of women got to the better of him. He was told that with Zhang Xiu in Wan City was Zhang Ji's widow. Now Zhang Ji, if you remember, obviously being Zhang Xiu's uncle, and that this widow was quite attractive. Cao Cao took her as one of his own concubines, and Zhang Xiu obviously was very insulted by this. This man had come into your city, you've opened the gates to him, you've submitted to him, he toasted to your friendship, and then he takes your uncle's widow. And at the same time, Cao Cao also heard about a ferocious officer within Zhang Xiu's rank, the aforementioned Hu Chi-er, or red-bearded child. Cao Cao decided to inspect this man and was very impressed by him, and decided to give him large amounts of gifts, and said that Hu Chi-er would serve Cao Cao in a more direct manner. Both of these events came to give Zhang Xiu a good degree of paranoia, probably rightly earned. Zhang Xiu was under the impression that Cao Cao being displeased, that Zhang Xiu was displeased at Cao Cao's taking of Zhang Xiu's, uncle's wife, that Cao Cao would then seek to have Zhang Xiu killed, and that Hu Chi provided the avenue via which Cao Cao would kill Zhang Xiu. This is not an unprecedented event. Remember that this is also how Lu Bu ended up going to Dongzhuo, by Dongzhuo giving him gifts and Lu Bu killing his own governor and adopted father. So Zhang Xiu went to his trusted advisor, Jia Xu, who's always set him right in the past, and asked him to make a plan, and this was the plan. In early March 197 AD, Zhang Xiu and Jia Xu came to Cao Cao and asked Cao Cao, stoking his hubris, possibly, and arrogance, if Zhang Xiu's troops could observe Cao Cao's troops in their camps, their maneuvers, their training, etc. Hey, I'm part of your faction now, I want to increase my own troops' training. Cao Cao gave no thought of this and agreed, and allowed Zhang Xiu to set up camp on a slightly higher ground just outside of Cao Cao's camp. While setting up this camp, Zhang Xiu then asked Cao Cao if his troops could wear their armors as they passed by Cao Cao's camp. The reason that he gave was that he himself did not have enough baggage trains to carry all those things up onto a mountain. Cao Cao again gave no real thought of this and agreed. You can see where this is going. And so, the Battle of Wan Castle begins. On a night, we're not sure exactly when, but sometime during early March 197 AD, Zhang Xiu launched a surprise attack with his armored troops that had been stationed up the mountains with a high ground on Cao Cao's camp. At the same time, his own forces within Wan Castle also launched an attack, and Cao Cao was surrounded by all sides, in disarray under a surprise night attack. At this time, our intrepid warrior Dian Wei decided to hold the gates, as he did many times in the past. And what followed next is the stuff that will pass on down to the legends, and I will let the history do the talking. Dian Wei battled at the gate, preventing the traders from entering. The troops then entered from the other gates. At the time, Dian Wei had about 10 or so men, and they fought a desperate battle, each fought like 10 men. The traders numbered many, and were coming from the front and rear. Dian Wei used his long crescent halberds, attacked left and right, destroying 10 or more. The surrounding area littered with many casualties and dead. Dian Wei received over 10 cuts, yet he continued to fight despite lacking troops. He held on to 2 traders underneath his arms, killing them. The remaining traders dared not advance any further. Dian Wei continued attacking the traders, killing numerous men. His wounds took its toll, he let out a great cry and then died. The traders dared not advance and take his head. Now we see another incident like the one before where the tide of a battle was shifted slightly by the action of one heroic officer and a few of his armored retainers. In this case, of course, Dian Wei wasn't able to turn the tide of the entire battle, but him holding the gates like that with his 10 armed retainers had managed to get Cao Cao the valuable time to escape. Unfortunately, this overall battle was a disaster for Cao Cao. He lost not only Dian Wei and a large amount of troops, but also his clansmen Cao Anmin and his eldest son Cao Ang. Apocryphal stories say that Cao Ang, in his dying breath, got his father onto a horse and sent his father off. And Cao Cao and all of his various units began to make a hasty retreat northwest with Zhang Xiu and Jia Xu in close pursuit. And at this point we do see a bright silver lining to this battle. Now the events of this are a little convoluted, so I'll sum it up as quickly as I can. During the retreat, many of Cao Cao's units fell into disarray, and one of his units, the famed Qingzhou Army Corps, that former band of rebels and refugees that he took in, began to loot local villages. Now Cao Cao's colonel Ru Jin, who managed to keep his own troops in very good order whilst they were retreating, decided that this looting was unacceptable and began to fight the Qingzhou Army Corps, driving them off. The Qingzhou Army Corps went to Cao Cao and reported that Ru Jin had turned traitor. Now Cao Cao approached Ru Jin's camp and saw that Ru Jin's camp was very well ordered, his troops were ready to fight, and many of Cao Cao's advisors advised that he must seek another way immediately. The rear guard was being held by Ru Jin as a way of encirclement against him. However, Cao Cao trusted Ru Jin, and Ru Jin trusted Cao Cao. Ru Jin's own men also said, "Look, stop lining up for battle. Go explain to Cao Cao what's happening." But Ru Jin himself held the line, even though at this time, within the chaos of battle, neither side's loyalty was clear. And when Zhang Xiu's pursuing troops came on, Ru Jin fought them off in a rear guard. Cao Cao had this to say to Ru Jin afterwards. "The trouble at Rushui is my direst hour. You have managed to control your troops amid such chaos, to fight off these enemies and to hold the position. You have shown the virtue of loyalty and the steadfastness. Even the generals of ancient times are no match for you." And so, with that silver lining, and with great heavy heart and a lot of casualties, we call the Battle of Wan Castle to the end. Zhang Xiu won this battle, without a doubt, and Cao Cao was forced to return to Xuchang, licking his wounds. After this, Zhang Xiu, openly having defected, went back to his old ally Liu Biao, and the entire faction as a whole made war upon Cao Cao. Cao Cao at this time, however, was not able to directly respond to this and sent his younger cousin Cao Hong, the one that saved his life at his first battle, to fend this off, and thus began a low-level conflict within the southern front against Zhang Xiu and Liu Biao. And this is now at March and April in 197 AD, and why was Cao Cao not able to fight off Zhang Xiu himself and had to send his junior cousin? Well, because the political situation in China was about to take a lightning shift, and Cao Cao had bigger issues to respond to than one tenacious general on the border. The second of Cao Cao's early campaigns was against Yuan Shu. Now, this campaign was kicked off by a shocking political act. In early 197 AD, Yuan Shu declared himself emperor of the new Zhong dynasty, in stark contrast to the Han dynasty. This is a little ironic considering that Yuan Shu was a huge part of the coalition to save the Han against the so-called tyrant and usurper Dong Zhuo. But let's look at the reasons why he did this. Now, the reasons why he did this in early 197 AD is a subject of contention even in modern-day China, because it seems like he drastically overplayed his hand. But without the benefit of hindsight, we'll go through each of the reasons why now was the appropriate time for Yuan Shu to make his play. Number 1. Somewhere around 190 to 197 AD, Yuan Shu gained the control of the imperial seal. You might remember that the imperial seal held by the emperor was lost during Dong Zhuo's burning of Luoyang, and common legends suggest that it was Sun Jian, who was Yuan Shu's general at that time, who got control of it. Sun Jian eventually gave this to Yuan Shu. There are several theories about why this happened. One was that in order to allow Sun Ce to become more independent and allow him to have an army, Sun Ce traded his father's imperial seal to Yuan Shu. Regardless of the fact that this is purely symbolic, it was still a huge act of legitimacy, and in the eyes of the common people, and maybe even some of the gentry, gave Yuan Shu some legitimacy. After all, Yuan Shu did not come from nowhere. We've mentioned before, but he is the most highly placed son of the Yuan family, which is the second most powerful political family in China at this time after the Liu family, the imperial clan. Whilst Yuan Shao was Yuan Shu's older brother, Yuan Shao was born to a concubine, whilst Yuan Shu was born to their father's proper wife. So, from a position of ancient Confucian China, he seemed right now to have a lot of legitimacy. The second issue was that early in 197 AD, Cao Cao secured the emperor. And when Cao Cao secured the emperor, it made him the de facto Han court. And the policy that he implemented was, as we know, the so-called suppress the rebellious in the name of the emperor. This gave a ticking time bomb under Yuan Shu, because Yuan Shu knew that when Cao Cao became the central court, all of Cao Cao's enemies would effectively become Yuan Shu's enemies, and Cao Cao was closer with Yuan Shu's older brother Yuan Shao, who Yuan Shu was a huge rival of. So when the emperor was powerless, Yuan Shu could play along as one of a dozen warlords, but with the emperor now in play, Yuan Shu needed his own source of legitimacy, and what better than to declare himself emperor. The third is that as of early 197 AD, Yuan Shu and his various supporters controlled a huge swath of China and was probably one of the two strongest factions alongside Yuan Shao. People often underplay this degree of support because people weren't aware of just who Yuan Shu's allies were at this time. Yuan Shu's key allies around this time includes the warlord Liu Xun, who controls the entire mid-Yangtze River around the city of Chaisang, as well as the little conqueror Sun Ce, who controlled much of southeastern China around the city of Jianye, which is modern-day Nanjing. Wu Jing, who controlled the commandery of Guangling, which is around modern-day Shanghai, as well as the god of war himself, Lu Bu, who controlled much of the Shu province. This, added together with Yuan Shu's already vast territories, meant that he effectively controlled around 1/3 of China, an area of around 2 or 2.5 provinces, depending on how you want to count it. And in addition to this, so many of Yuan Shu's potential rivals were at war with each other. His elder brother Yuan Shao was engaged in a very long and vast war in the north against Gongsun Zan. Cao Cao, the new central government, was struggling against Zhang Xiu. Meanwhile, the god of war Lu Bu was taking care of Liu Bei, who at this time had become the governor of the Shu province. And so, with all of these things in play, Yuan Shu thought he had a pretty good shot. Well, let's see how that actually worked out. Immediately after declaring himself emperor, Cao Cao, acting on behalf of the Han court, began what can only be called a quick Game of Thrones. And what Cao Cao's strategy was at this time was to identify the key supporters of Yuan Shu and convince them to go to his side with a mix of threats, bribes, appeals to morality, appeals to practicality. He reached out, most importantly, to Yuan Shu's two most powerful supporters, arguably, the god of war Lu Bu and the little conqueror Sun Ce. He managed to convince both of them to, if not defect entirely to the Han court, then at least stay neutral to the ensuing struggle, as he was threatening war on Yuan Shu in a big way. Sun Ce and Lu Bu both agreed to go neutral. In fact, Sun Ce did something further. He agreed in exchange for a rather big promotion within the Han court to also not only join the anti-Yuan Shu coalition, but reach out to his own allies within Yuan Shu's courts. The two he reached out to was his uncle Wu Jing and his clansman Sun Ben, who together held the Guangling commandery, as in around modern-day Shanghai, and both of them promptly turned as well. Yuan Shu, now utterly isolated, as a counterweight, reached out to Zulang. Zulang is the leader of the Shanyue tribes, which operates around the outskirts of modern-day Nanjing and were a non-Han people. Now, without getting too much into it, Sun Ce essentially represented the interests of migrants who came from the north several hundred years ago and then made their homes around the lands of Wu. Meanwhile, Zulang represented the interests of the local Shanyue, who, whilst being a largely Sinicized people and also subjects of the empire, were around much earlier. And the two groups had never really gotten along, and so the enemy of my enemy became my friend, and Zulang allied with Yuan Shu and promised a campaign of guerrilla warfare against Sun Ce. And so the stage was set, and despite that counterweight at the end, Yuan Shu was in a much worse position than just a few months ago. He had overestimated his support and lost the support of most of his key allies. Without waiting for his political situation to turn any worse, Yuan Shu made his move. He took a huge army and began to attack Cao Cao, specifically with the goal of driving towards Chenliu, one of Cao Cao's core bases of support. Meanwhile, Zulang in the rear began a campaign of guerrilla warfare against Sun Ce. However, this didn't work out as well as he hoped. By mid-197 AD, Cao Cao had soundly defeated his army going for Chenliu. Meanwhile, on the east, Lü Bu was making a counterattack around the regions of Lake Baima, driving towards him, and Zulang's guerrilla war was getting nowhere. Around autumn 197 AD, Cao Cao began his counterattack. He focused on the two key cities of Runan and Shouchun. These acted as the centers of Yuan Shu's support. And by autumn 197 AD, Yuan Shu had lost both of the cities. The sieges were apparently very bloody and very closely fought, and supplies were desperate on all sides. But at the end of the campaign, Lü Bu had driven Yuan Shu to the south. Meanwhile, Cao Cao had eliminated all of Yuan Shu's holdings north of the Huai River. And from this point onwards, Yuan Shu will become, from one of the most feared forces in China, as well as a contender for the throne, just a rump warlord state that was getting slowly choked off by the alliance. It's at this point that we have to return to Cao Cao's second and third war against Zhang Xiu, that tenacious border general who will not give up. We last left off at April 197 AD after the disastrous battle of Wan Castle, with Cao Cao licking his wounds. Shortly after that, the commanderies around Wancheng began to rebel against Cao Cao. And this rebellion lasted somewhere between April and November 179 AD. As we mentioned, Cao Cao sent his junior cousin Cao Hong to put down the rebellions and face off against Zhang Xiu, whilst he himself was carrying on the campaign against Yuan Shu, which would prove far more fruitful to him. Whilst in response, Zhang Xiu's ally and benefactor Liu Biao also sent his own reinforcements. This low-level conflict would last until autumn 197 AD. The status quo returned as Cao Hong successfully put down the rebellions and brought all of those wayward commanderies back into Cao Cao's fold. At this point, Liu Biao sent a rather large reinforcement under the army of Deng Ji in an attempt to outflank and destroy Cao Hong. Cao Cao, however, was already done with his campaign against Yuan Shu and back in Xuchang, and responded in kind. The battle was short and bloody, and Cao Cao destroyed Deng Ji's army as well as captured Deng Ji himself. With the threat seen off and Cao Cao's army victorious and the status quo restored, Cao Cao and Cao Hong began to make their way back to Xuchang, at which point their army passed the site of the first battle of Wancheng. And at this point, the history books record something rather emotional. The memory brought tears to his eyes. A memorial was arranged in which Cao Cao personally wept. Dian Wei's son Dian Man was made gentleman of the household. Whenever Cao Cao's army passed by, they would offer sacrifice and he would think of Dian Wei. Even after many months, and indeed many years afterwards, Cao Cao could not pass the spot of his great defeat against Zhang Xiu without being brought to tears. Now, one thing to note about this historical episode is that whenever he mourned, Cao Cao always placed Dian Wei first. He was always the most moved when remembering Dian Wei's personal loyalty and act of heroism that saved him in that battle, not that of his own clansman Cao Anmin or his eldest and first son Cao Ang. In fact, to the men serving under him, this was merely another sign of Cao Cao's greatness, that he would care about loyalty, acts of great bravery and service to him from an officer over the sacrifices of his own children and clansmen. However, to his own family, this also brought some deep wounds. Specifically, Cao Cao's first wife, Lady Ding. Cao Ang was not Lady Ding's natural-born son. However, Lady Ding raised Cao Ang as her own since Cao Ang's birth mother died early. When Lady Ding heard that Cao Ang had died, she blamed her husband. The fights that Lady Ding and Cao Cao had were apparently legendary, with Lady Ding being sent back to her own family because Cao Cao could not stand it anymore. After that, Cao Cao would go and chase after her and try to bring her back, and she would refuse to come with him. Eventually, Cao Cao granted Lady Ding divorce. However, one touching human side of this is that Cao Cao's next primary wife, Lady Bian, the entire time stayed good friends with Lady Ding, and whenever Cao Cao was away on campaign, Lady Bian would invite Lady Ding to stay with her. Although Lady Ding was given permission to remarry, she never did, and apparently mourned the loss of her adopted son for the rest of her life, whilst Cao Cao was also racked by guilt, although he rarely let it show. Instead, Cao Cao would always describe that he was most touched by the loyal sacrifice and bravery of his eternal servant Dian Wei. After winter passed, in March of 198 AD, when the snows had melted enough for the campaigns to begin again, Cao Cao came back with a vengeance, leading an attack out of Xuchang against Zhang Xiu for a third time. Liu Biao responded in kind and personally led an army in reinforcement of Zhang Xiu. This campaign dragged on, with both sides maneuvering to gain the better position for a while. In April of 198 AD, Liu Biao managed to outflank Cao Cao and position himself to the rear. Cao Cao now was caught between two armies. At this time, Xun Yu sent an urgent message to Cao Cao asking him what to do. Should Xun Yu lead out a reinforcement against them? Cao Cao instead replied calmly that he will win a great battle at the county of Rong on his retreat back to Xuchang. Knowing his lord as he did, Xun Yu acquiesced. And so the Battle of Rong County happened. Cao Cao defeated both Zhang Xiu and Liu Biao in a two-pronged attack. And there was really not much else written about this battle except for one episode we'll go into later, but however, when Cao Cao did return to Xuchang, Xun Yu asked him, how did you know you would win despite being surrounded, and Cao Cao answered, because the enemy has a choice to retreat whilst we do not. Now what is this other interesting anecdote we want to mention? We want to mention the struggle between Cao Cao and Jia Xu during this battle, two masters of strategy. I will let the history do the talking for me once again. Once Cao Cao had his army retreat, Zhang Xiu was about to personally lead a pursuit. Jia Xu said to Zhang Xiu, do not chase after them, you will certainly lose. Zhang Xiu did not listen and pushed his men to go forward to do battle. He returned after suffering heavy losses. Jia Xu then said to him, quickly, go after them, the second battle will be a great victory. Zhang Xiu believed him, and having regrouped his men, left again in pursuit. A great battle ensued, and he did indeed return triumphant. He asked Jia Xu, when I led elite troops to pursue a retreating army, you, sir, said that I would lose, but after I lost, I took a beaten force to attack a victorious enemy, and you said that I would prevail. It was indeed as you have said. Why is it that these two things, apparently contradictory, both came true? Jia Xu said, this is easy to understand. Though you, general, are adept at deploying troops, you are not a match for Lord Cao. Even when their army was starting to retreat, Lord Cao must have been guarding the rear himself. Though your pursuing troops were elite, their leader was not a match for the enemy leader, and the enemy soldiers were just as battle ready. From that, I knew you would lose. Lord Cao had not made a mistake since the beginning of his campaign against you, but he retreated before their strength was exhausted. This must be because of some drastic incident happening in his land. Once he had defeated you, he would have regrouped and traveled swiftly back. Even if he left generals in the rear, and even if they were men of prowess, they would never be a match for you. That's why you were sure to win, using routed troops to do battle. Zhang Xiu was convinced, and from this point on, trusted Jia Xu utterly. And again, this is another display of his preternatal battle abilities, despite not leading troops personally. So we end in August 198 AD with both sides retreating to their corners, and Cao Cao, despite having won a tactical victory, not making any great strategic gains. Now why did Cao Cao retreat so suddenly? It was as Jia Xu predicted, something had happened. Now the last time we visited the coalition against Yuan Shu, things were going very well, but as these things tend to happen, the coalition soon fell apart to infighting. Specifically, the god of war Lu Bu, who doesn't have the most exactly trustworthy history, decided that he wanted more land and began to attack Liu Bei, who was also part of the coalition, attacking Liu Bei's town of Xiaopei. Liu Bei, in a panic, decided to go to Cao Cao's for help, and, rather predictably, Lu Bu decided to go to Yuan Shu for help, and thus, he was one of the few cases of somebody who defected from the Zhong to the Han and then back to the Zhong. And so by December 198 AD, Lu Bu had seized control of most of the Shu province and was desperately attacking Liu Bei for the rest of it, and Cao Cao would have to march off once again to face the god of war. And so ends part 3 of our Rise of Cao Cao series. We've seen some of his earlier campaigns. We've seen that he is indeed somebody of sound tactical mind who wins more battle than he loses. However, this was still not at the stage of Cao Cao's meteoric rise. We're merely seeing his scrappy beginnings. In the next episode, we'll go over his battle against Lu Bu in the infamous Siege of Xiapi, when we finally see the hero of chaos break the god of war. And I'm hoping that the hiatus between this episode and the next episode will not be as long as the last hiatus, because we are back on track now making these videos, unlike the first ones where I made the videos and then just waited for the game to come out. That will be all for this time. please rate and subscribe. Thanks for sitting through all of this, and I will see you all next time. Peace out.